Recording.
Welcome and hello from Judith Fisher. As Bob Scholl said, he's in South Africa. Well, I'm in Canada, so in a very icy environment. So thank you very much to everyone for joining us. We're going to very briefly move through the knowledge gaps and the knowledge needs, which we hope you will contribute to over the next 3 weeks. Next slide, please. So I guess the main idea is for us to, of this presentation, is to give you an understanding of how the process will work and what we are going to be doing in the next few weeks, and understand the structure and the way in which we'll be identifying this through the land degradation and restoration assessment. We will introduce the main discussion areas and the topics to be presented. And then we're going to explain to you and provide entry points into trigger points, which we hope will elicit conversations from you and discussions. Next slide, please. So what we're working on is, you'll see now, a knowledge pyramid. When we're talking about knowledge, we are thinking at many levels of knowledge, including data, information, and knowledge from many sources, and also the wisdom that has come into the processes through these different knowledge sources. We are hoping in this access to knowledge and working on knowledge to understand the relations between all the different forms of knowledge, the patterns which may evolve, and the key principles behind knowledge generation. Next slide, please. So we talk about both knowledge gaps and knowledge needs. For this particular webinar, we are talking about knowledge gaps in terms of what do we not have enough knowledge on in terms of data, information, research and studies from research, and other types of knowledge sources. Now, by other types of knowledge sources, we're referring to, for instance, Indigenous knowledge sources, faith-based knowledge sources, but many sources of knowledge which are available in addition to the scientific knowledge. And these knowledge gaps have been identified from the work of the authors of the IPBES Land Degradation and Restoration Assessment. When we refer to knowledge needs, this is where we're really looking forward to some help from yourselves. We're trying to put together a prioritisation, not only of the knowledge gaps from the IPBES assessment, but also from yourselves as potential users, experts and knowledge holders. So we're really keen to hear what you feel are the needs coming from your communities. In particular, though, for this, we are really focused on needs related to policy context and also to some targeted objectives. And we'll have a look at those targeted objectives at the moment. Next slide, please. So within the Land Degradation Restoration Assessment, we were specifically focused on the definitions which were assigned to us through a scoping project with the governments of IPBES. This has actually made it very easy for us to really work very constrained to these definitions. There are many definitions, but by following these definitions, it was very specific and it was very helpful. And we will continue to use these definitions throughout any outcomes from the webinar series. So we have a definition of land degradation, which is about human-caused drivers for the loss of biodiversity, ecosystem function or services. And when we're talking about degraded land, we're talking about the state of land which has declined from degradation processes that cannot be fully recovered within decadal timescales. So that is a really specific understanding of degraded land. And that also can refer to many different areas, such as degraded land related to biodiversity or agriculture, which is then what we're referring to transform natural ecosystems. And that brings in the agriculture and managed forests, for instance. The other thing that we're really focusing on in terms of definitions are restoration. So we have a very quite simple definition, which is restoration is defined as any intentional activity that initiates or accelerates the recovery of an ecosystem from a degraded state. And then when we refer to rehabilitation, we're using that term to refer to restoration activities that may fall short of fully restoring the biotic community to its pre-degradation state. So I just would urge you to look at these definitions so that we are all working along the same lines. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we've divided our proposed knowledge gaps into some four topics with their sub-themes. Now, the first topic is related to data, information management, monitoring, and scales that are limiting the current understanding of the status and trends of land degradation and restoration. So within that knowledge gaps, we have come up with five proposed topics to discuss. One is about data availability and coverage. We may have some excellent data in some places and very poor data in other places. And also in that data availability, we're not really, what is also we found quite a problem is that the manner in which the data collected may not be consistent, and so then it becomes very difficult to compare data across landscapes and regions. Now, monitoring has turned out to be an extremely significant part of this process, that we need to know more about how we can do monitoring. It's been identified as a very large gap, and from monitoring we can then understand the changes that are occurring across time, which is a critical thing to know whether we are actually reversing the degradation of landscapes. A next important one is evaluation and verification of systems, and also extremely important is doing a monitoring of how effective the policies are, which are related to land degradation and restoration. The next topic is indicators and scaling. Next slide, please. So the second area that we're considering on knowledge gaps is related to the drivers and causes of land degradation. Now, within that, we are particularly interested in the indirect drivers, and also their linkages with distant social, economic and political processes. And we're also interested to understand more about the direct drivers of degradation, for example, invasive species and many other impacts, and the interaction across the different drivers. Next slide, please. So the third area that we're interested to work in is related to the impacts and consequences of land degradation and restoration. It's nice to understand what the impacts may be when degradation occurs, but it's also extremely good to understand what those consequences of those impacts are. So we have then some subtopics that we have identified under this heading. One is understanding better the ecological impacts and their consequences. We feel there's a real knowledge gap in this area. The next is the better understanding of the consequences of land degradation, not only for the landscape and the biophysical environment, but also for physical impacts, which also includes infectious diseases, human health, mental health, and spiritual well-being. So we are working not only on the biophysical, but also the relationships to people and the people who live in those landscapes. The third one is really we need to have a better understanding of the consequences of the interactions among land degradation, restoration, poverty, climate change, and the risk of conflict and migration, which we found is occurring as a result of land degradation. And then the fourth one is really to look at solutions. We need to find solutions, not just identify what the problems are, but what are the solutions to land degradation and restoration, and in particular for local and Indigenous communities. Next slide, please. Now, the fourth topic is related to facilitating factors and solutions. Under these subtopics, under this topic we have 4 subtopics, but we really need to understand what the enabling institution and governance mechanisms are to make improvements into the degradation of landscapes and into the restoration. The governance factors have shown very strongly throughout our assessment to be a key factor. If we can get the governance right, many other things will fall into a place. And this governance is also very much related to social, cultural, economic, and many other contexts. So this is a topic that we have identified as a large gap. Also, very important in IPBES is IPBES' relationship with local Indigenous communities and their knowledge and engagement. So IPBES really prides itself on working with Indigenous communities, but we need to understand better how we can do that and how we can ensure that their Indigenous communities' understandings of degradation and restoration can assist with this the improvement of landscapes over time and solutions. The third one is the interactions amongst policies and land and resource management practices, in particular in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals and many other multilateral agreements, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Climate Change Convention. And also, we need to look into models and scenarios of land degradation and restoration. Next slide, please. So, also in all of this, which is really, I think, the area that helps to bring into focus so that we don't silo and separate different factors, is looking from very transdisciplinary approaches to the whole topic. Now, some of the things we need to discuss in that arena are the human and nature relationships and the changes in society over time and how these impact on perceptions of land degradation and restoration. How we can really work well to incorporate scientific studies and assessments and other types of knowledge. And once again, this refers back to the excellent work and cooperation IPBES has had with Indigenous and local communities around the globe. The idea of a best baseline and reference state, and then how do we evaluate the restoration activities and how effective they are. Next slide, please. So throughout the webinar series, we will be providing with you, and these are developed by the authors of the IPBES assessment, trigger points. So this here is an example of a trigger point which we've put together around Indigenous communities and their knowledge and engagement. So the words we have put here have come specifically as a summary from findings of the assessment, and we're hoping that those words within the trigger point will assist you in contributing to our assessment, to the webinar series. So we really know that Indigenous communities hold significant knowledge and understandings about the consequences of land degradation and solutions to overcome those problems. But what we are finding that how do we really bring their knowledge into these decision-making processes? So there's a lot of knowledge there, but we need to bring it into decision-making, planning, and policy documents to assist the avoidance, reduction, and reversal of land degradation. We know that traditional knowledge and practices, which have developed from centuries of connections to landscapes and close associations with them, can provide solutions to improve the state of degradation and enhance restoration. But how do we get those solutions into an operational phase at local levels so that it is become recognised and acknowledged by policymakers and others when seeking viable solutions? So thank you very much for your work, and we look forward to fantastic contributions from yourselves over the next 3 weeks to assist us to take the IPBES land degradation forward with your contributions. Thank you.